Hello and welcome to the G20 debate with me, Wasbir Hussain. The G20 summit in New Delhi has clearly been one of the crown jewels for Indian diplomacy and has propelled India to the global high table under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Despite the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine war, it is to India's credit that under its presidency, the African Union has been admitted as a permanent member of the G20, thereby going a long way in removing the global trust deficit. Besides, the adoption of a 100% consensual Delhi declaration overcoming major differences over the Russia-Ukraine war is nothing but a big diplomatic victory for India. The declaration was thrashed out with the Indian negotiators burning the midnight oil with the two factions, the Western Bloc at one end and the Chinese and Russian side on the other. Among other things, the 37-page New Delhi Leaders Summit declaration calls upon all nations to uphold international law principles, including territorial integrity and sovereignty. It also advocated for initiatives aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just and durable peace in Ukraine, while firmly stating that the use of threat of using nuclear weapons is unacceptable. Other takeaways during the leaders' meeting in New Delhi has been the launch of the Global Biofuel Alliance with India, US and Brazil taking the lead. Also, plans for a mega economic connectivity corridor linking India, Middle East, Europe was unveiled, which is obviously a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Several questions arise. Will India's growing global stature be a deterrent against arch-rival China? What next for India in the world stage? Will India now get to be a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council? To discuss the outcome of this mega diplomatic extravaganza, the G20 summit in New Delhi, I am joined tonight by Ambassador Leela K. Ponnappa, India's former Deputy National Security Advisor. I have with me Dr. Swaran Singh, Professor of Diplomacy and Disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and a leading global affairs expert. And also with me is Mr. Rudy Warjri, a former Indian ambassador to Peru, Colombia, and former High Commissioner to the Sultanate of Brunei. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special show. First of all, let me go to Ambassador Leela Ponnappa, former Deputy National Security Advisor. Why do you consider it a big victory for India? Everyone is saying that it is a big victory for India. There are world leaders who had said during the summit itself, while talking to journalists, that this has been a big victory for India. Ambassador Ponnappa.
Thank you. Good evening to all. I see this as a process and not necessarily as a victory or any such thing, in the sense that the G20 represents, to my mind, the evolution of a new multilateral organization, comparatively new, first established in 1999, because of a growing dissatisfaction with the manner in which the UN system was functioning. And people felt that it was not responsive to the new realities of emerging economies, of the fact that the structure really reflected the victors of World War II and not the countries that had developed, whose economies had grown into what is now the 21st century. And being responsible and active members of the international and the multilateral community, India has been a member of the G20 from the start, as against the kind of waiting that we continue to do with regard to becoming permanent members of the Security Council. And it was India's turn to host the summit. And I do believe that India has tried to give it a certain definition. But I think we need to look at it as part of a process in terms of how effectively the countries concerned, in this case the G20 membership and now 21 with the African Union, actually are able to successfully implement all that they have talked about. And they've talked about a lot. Earlier, when G20 was set up, it was purely for fiscal and monetary stability, financial stability. But today, the agenda covers pretty much everything that UN and its agencies cover. Health,
Right.
youth, empowerment, labor, and so on and so forth. But plus, of course, certain security issues. So I think we need to see this as a process, and we need to
Okay.
see this as an event where India has put in a lot of effort to try to
Absolutely.
bring together all the countries concerned for
Okay.
consensus.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Ambassador Ponappa. Let me go to Professor Swaran Singh. Professor, how do you look at the outcome of the G20 summit? Not many people, there were a lot of people who were not optimistic that the summit would be able to come up with a leader's declaration this time round, because obviously because of the stand of the countries, the two blocs, that is the Western bloc, China and Russia, over the Russia-Ukraine war. At the end of the day, the Indian diplomats, they worked hard and came up with a language that was acceptable to both the blocs, and it was a 100% consensual declaration. How do you look at it?
Thank you, Wasbir. I think there were open and well-known differences, that were serious differences on debt waiving or deferment. There were differences on eliminating or reducing use of fossil fuels. There were differences on climate finance. And of course, the greatest news about differences was about Ukraine, as to how that will be described. And I think there is obviously a great deal of media coverage now, how the diplomatic finesse of Indian team really worked so hard that it ended up producing the longest final declaration ever in G20 and now 21 history, and producing it just at end of the very first session, rather than we often see these multilateral meetings extending their last sessions to make that consensus possible.
Yes.
So I think I agree this is a process, but this is definitely a very major milestone, what I will describe in making India ready for its world role at the world stage, and making the world ready to look at India emerging and playing a very substantive role in coming times. Whether it is the level of training, making aware your common masses in India with holding so many events in so many big and small towns and cities, making it into what Prime Minister says, People's Festival. That is the way you create a certain groundswell and train your voters, who will be able to understand why their national leadership is willing to invest time, attention, and resources on issues that are largely going to be regional and global. So, at one level, this was used to train Indian masses into the changing role of India.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I think major changes in structure itself, by
Right.
bringing in African Union in next 10 seconds, I want to underline, now G21 involves nearly 90 countries, which also include the topmost 20 economies. And in that sense, it's an organization emerging almost like a parallel to United Nations, which doesn't have Security Council problems. And in that sense, I think a lot of fundamental changes of bringing global south to center stage, human-centric development, women-led development, and so on, innovative ideas one after another. So to me, it's definitely a major milestone in India's transforming role at the global stage.
Yes, a major milestone for India. Ambassador Rudy Wardry. Ambassador Wardry, do you have a different perspective at the end of the day, as Ambassador Ponappa outlined right in her opening remarks, that initially this was some kind of an economic grouping, but now it is one of the most influential groupings in the world, 20 plus 1 now. How do you look at it? Of course, the India's presidency has been eventful, because imagine if there would have been no declaration, what would have been the outcome of this summit?
Okay. Before I come to your question, Wasbir, thank you very much. In fact, I am at a little disadvantage because I'm not able to see any of the panelists, and in fact, most of what they say is inaudible to me. Anyway, I'm happy to be in the company of my esteemed senior colleague, Ambassador Leela Ponappa and Professor Swaran Singh from JNU. And first of all, I think I must congratulate my colleagues, younger colleagues in MEA, for having come out with this massive document, 37-page declaration, and work, burn the midnight oil to be able to come out with such a declaration, and a consensus declaration at that. And of course, there's so many elements in that declaration, ranging from the leadership of India of the Global South, as well as so many other recommendations there. But what I want to say is, in fact, to answer to your question, that even though initially it was meant to be economic, it has turned out to also to be geopolitical. But at the same time, I think in this particular event, in this particular occasion, I think India has gained, in the sense that the fact that China didn't attend, that Xi Jinping didn't come, in fact enabled India to project its own personality even better, and in fact outsmart China, in the sense that India could take credit for having enabled the Global South, and is particularly in the fact that the EU, the African Union, has become the 21st member of the G20. So that's how my perspective is.
Well, Ambassador Ponnappa, now basically what we have seen is that people describing, and analysts around the globe, around the world, are describing it as a coup for New Delhi, especially within the context of strategic competition against Beijing, helping it to become the leader of the bloc, India, that is. Now, do you have some pessimism there? From your opening remarks, don't you consider it that India has come to the world stage? Don't you think that this is one of the biggest diplomatic achievements in India's foreign policy history?
Sort of reservations about it, but all I'm saying is we must be realistic. And India has always been on the world stage. India is far too big and important a country not to be in the world stage. But today we are at a point where our economy has grown. And by the economy, I just don't mean the financials. I mean our skill capabilities, our technological capabilities. Chandrayaan, of course, was grand. But there was so much else that is also happening, both within the public and the private sector. And I think these matters have come to a kind of head. And as I've said elsewhere, it's like it was India's time has come. And I think to be able to speak really for the global south, as it's called, developing countries, third world, whatever definition you choose to use, that has been going on for decades. And at the same time, to be able to straddle the divide between the global south and the developed countries, because there are areas of technology, of science, and so on, where India is up there with anybody else. So I think this is the great opportunity, and I think the achievement that India has brought to the table. And because of this, I believe India finds acceptance. Now, this notion that because China was away, therefore India was able to prevail, as it were, and provide the leadership. The G20 is a forum of equals. Everybody has a veto. There's no such thing as just permanent members who don't have a veto. And therefore, consensus becomes important. And Indian diplomacy has had a long and distinguished track record of being able to derive consensus where there have been differences. At any international conference, at the end of the day, the outcome is the document. And the document, as you very rightly pointed out, was the result of the hard work put together by the diplomats who worked quietly behind the scenes over many weeks and months, I might tell you. There wasn't a rabbit out of a hat. They have worked with each of the countries to come up with something that is acceptable to all sides. So is everybody 100% happy? Maybe not. But at the same time, you have an acceptable document on the basis of which to move forward.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. There were 200 hours of non-stop meetings, 300 bilateral meetings, and 15 drafts, at the end of which we have that joint leaders declaration. Professor.
And many sleepless nights.
Absolutely, Ambassador. Yes. Professor Swaran Singh, Let me ask you a totally different question. It has been the domestic discourse that determines the success of any political party in the Indian national elections. But do you think after G20, do you think 2024 will be different? Do you think foreign policy could also be a determining factor for election results? Do you think the BJP, or for that matter the government of Prime Minister Modi himself is going to talk about this as a huge success? Do you think this is going to have an impact in the national elections next year?
On this, Basveer, I think I will agree with the Ambassador Ponappa on this. It's an ongoing process. India's foreign policy had started becoming a part of national elections, general elections, if not local elections, since mid 1990s, and 1998 nuclear tests provided a big boost where foreign policy issues started becoming part of our general federal elections. Second, because India has also been seen and is actually growing over a period of time. Now it is the fifth largest economy, going to be third largest economy. So any country that emerges as a major influencer in regional and global affairs begins to engage itself much more on those issues, and therefore it must train its citizens as to why its national leaders are spending money and efforts and attention on global issues and not focusing all the time 100% on domestic issues. And therefore, that again pushes a country's leadership to strengthen that linkage of domestic politics and foreign policy. But theoretically, I'm an academic, so I could even go back to Jawaharlal Nehru, who used to say foreign policy is nothing but extension of domestic politics. So the nature of domestic politics determines what kind of international role a country is going to play. And in that sense, this increasing focus on linking with diaspora, increasing focus on front-loading India's civilizational ethos, culture, cuisine, and all kinds of other, sculpture and whatnot, is to locate India's foreign policy now increasingly in civilizational ethos of India. And that's how Prime Minister began his speech quoting from a kind of a Prakrit, write-up, which talks about India looking at welfare of humanity. Indeed, your Constitution, Article 51, also talks of building peace for human race, not international relations peace.
Yeah.
So that perspective has always been central, and this, as India becomes stronger and influential, that link of domestic politics and foreign policy will become far more visible to all of us.
Absolutely, that would be interesting. Ambassador Vajri, we always hear about domestic issues. If it is in the Northeast, we'll hear about insurgency, we'll hear about peace, we'll hear about promises about development. Do you think this time around things are going to be different? 2024, India is going to talk about its stature in the world stage, its success in the G20, its ability, its success in the even technology field, like sending the space missions, Chandrayaan and so on. Do you think the discourse is going to be different this time around? What do you predict?
Okay, I'm glad you asked me this question, because as much as so much has been achieved, especially with the run-up to the G20 summit, all through these months, right from December last year, including taking these different meetings to different states of India, including the Northeast India. And at the same time, so much has been said in this document, the declaration, but there is certainly a disconnect between what we are projecting abroad and externally and what is happening in India domestically. Now, if you look at it, for instance, now the meetings in the state of Manipur, for instance, it was on ICT, information communication technology. But today in Manipur, for more than 4 months, there is no internet at all. So this is really a serious disconnect between what we are projecting internationally and what is happening domestically. I'm
No.
not even elaborating on the rest of what's happening, because in para 78 itself of this declaration, there is something that they say: we strongly deplore any acts of religious hatred of any kind. But what has been happening in Manipur or in the rest of India all
Take
these
it.
months, I hope,
Yeah.
if you are talking, in fact, the question
Okay,
you're
let me
asking the
let
panelists
me
before
go.
me
Absolutely,
was about
I get your
whether
point. I
Prime
get
Minister
your point.
Modi will take advantage of
What you are
this.
saying, Ambassador Wardry. I'm coming to you, Ambassador Ponappa. Once again, I'd like to go to Professor Swaran Singh. Professor Swaran Singh, what next for India? A lot of people wants to know what next for India. Does it give India and some kind of a that rise in India's stature? Is it going to act as some kind of a deterrent against China, at least diplomatically? Number one. Number two, what next for India? Number three, is India likely to get a permanent membership of the UN Security Council? US President Joe Biden once again promised Prime Minister Modi that US is going to support once again. So what do you think? What next?
Basfir, I'm going to give you out of box answers, just like the final declaration has given out of box answers. Let me first deal with UN Security Council membership for India. I remember when President Obama came in December or November of 2010, that is the first very strong statement made by the United States to, express their desire to see India having a permanent seat on UN Security Council. I hold a contrarian view. India outside the Security Council is more influential than it will be inside as a permanent member. It is not easy for permanent members, which are not really as powerful, to stand against either Russia or United States to be able to speak their voice. They are often pressurized to, veto or support their veto in favor of United States. So India outside, when it is seen as the most deserving country to become a permanent member of UN Security Council, draws much more respect. It commands much more influence than becoming a member and perhaps towing the line to any of the powers who might push us around to follow their line. Second, about your question on what is next for India. I suppose the first immediate next for India is to make sure that consensus that India has built on 112 issues, 83 issues, and 39 separate attached items, which are mostly reports of several expert groups, is to see how to implement that. And that is how India has proposed to hold a virtual summit before India's presidency comes to an end in November. And of course, maybe Indian Prime Minister is going to visit and join the APEC meeting in San Francisco in middle of November. We are hearing that Quad Summit meeting may happen to coincide with the Republic Day celebrations in India, 26 January next year. So now you're going to see the frequency and, of course, grandeur of such mega events, and where India is hosting them or India is being present in those, to become far more regular affair. And that hyperactive pace, which we are already noticing, Prime Minister's hyperactive pace in international diplomacy is something which makes him most visible around the world, will now be continuing in terms of India in totality engaging many of these events, possibly hosting more and more events in India. So basically contributing to see things that India is able to take several countries along are also implemented. And final very quick point, to also make important contributions to that. For example, India is now openly offering sharing of our digital platforms. India is propounding starting of digital public infrastructure. Now, this is a very different thing than imagine 18th, 19th, 20th century technology transfers, where few
Yeah.
countries, advanced countries, had advanced technologies. It was not possible for others to get it, or it was extremely costly to get it. To now a country saying, I have created some very successful advanced online platforms, but I'm willing to openly and freely share with whosoever wants to take it, whether it is advanced country or it is least advanced country. We are open to sharing our UPI platforms of online payments or our CoWIN, for example, several such examples. But from there, India now is also beginning to say, let us at the global level make common understanding, common policy, common norms On cryptocurrency, this whole weaponization of dollar debate takes a very different turn when you start talking about not just BRICS
Yeah.
currency, but cryptocurrency. So India is going to be extremely innovative. India has to be innovative in order to stay on course of emerging as an influence around the world. So I think this final declaration has actually brought the onus much more, that if Indian diplomats were having sleepless nights, they better prepare for more sleepless nights in coming time.
In the days ahead. Ambassador Ponappa, I mean, like, I would like to get your perspective on what next for India. We have heard Swaran that India is proactive. Yes, that is no denying the fact that Prime Minister Modi has been extremely proactive as far as his diplomatic initiatives are concerned. He is seen around the world more often these days. He always makes it a point to talk to the Indian diaspora and so on and so forth. He knows most of the world leaders personally, because of his frequent visits abroad. Now, what next for India? A lot of people would like to know, and let's hear your perspective on that.
What next for India has to be seen in its totality. And the totality includes both our domestic positions as well as our international engagement. Now, then there are challenges. There are some very serious challenges, as Rudy has pointed out, and elsewhere in many sectors. But I do believe that India's strength is that net, ultimately, sometimes there is a price to pay, there is pain, but we will find equilibrium. And I think the democratic way is the way to do it. This is our strength, and this is what we also bring to the world, which is why, as I said, the G20 is a body where everybody has a veto, not just a select few, and not just a bunch of countries that won a war over 5 decades ago. So, and this engagement will continue because foreign policy and domestic policy, foreign relations and domestic situations are two sides of the same coin. As I believe a former foreign secretary once told a former prime minister, the image can never be brighter than the reality.
Yeah.
That's a law of physics. And I believe there is a lot to commend India, but there is also a lot that India has to work on. And I believe the international community appreciates this. I think they recognize it, which is probably one reason why China, no Russia, it was really irrelevant. Even if there was no declaration, in my view, it would not have mattered. The chairman, the prime minister, would have made a chairman's statement. He would have reflected the differences, and differences too are a reality of life, whether we are talking in our internal situation or externally. But the effort has to really be to achieve that some conjoining by which there is a commitment to work together. Now, if I take your question further in terms of external relations, saying what next for India. Now, G20 represents, as I said, a quest for more stable multilateralism. Now, multilateralism, ultimately what happens? Every country brings its own national interests to the table. You look
Yes.
at the declaration, it says each of us spoke about our national positions, or in this case, about Ukraine. And this is always the case. There are certain limits. Or if you take a look at the international trade negotiations, where India has always held out with regard to protecting the interests of its farmers, of its poor, and with regard to health supplies, particularly pharmaceuticals. So this is a type of engagement. There's no end to engagement. There's no end to history. The process has to take place. The effort has to continue. And
Absolutely.
I do believe this effort will continue, as we have seen. India, as I said at the outset, has always been a player on the world
Global
stage.
stage.
Sometimes
Absolutely.
we punched above our weight. But today we are at a time where our economy and our resilience gives us certain strengths to be able to engage
Right.
successfully externally and to deal with our challenges internally.
Absolutely.
It can be difficult. There are ups and downs, but I think the kind of discussion that we are having today is also a demonstration of what is possible. The fact that China and Russia did not come, as I said, is really irrelevant because that demonstrates the problems of the multilateral system.
Yes.
Where on the one hand you set up a body to
I'll
go by consensus, and on the other hand,
I
politics
will
get
come
played.
back to I'll come back to you, Ambassador Ponappa. I'd like to thank Dr. Swaran Singh at this point. I'll go for a short break. When I come back, I'll go straight to Ambassador Rudy Wasbir and Ambassador Leela Ponappa. Don't go away. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Before I go to Ambassador Rudy Wasbir, let's listen in to some world leaders, what they had to say on the G20 summit in New Delhi. First, let's listen in to the Brazilian president. Of course, the next G20 presidency goes to Brazil. The Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is the Brazilian president. Let's listen into what he had said.
I would like to congratulate India because what India did, it organized an exceptionally well-organized summit meeting.
Okay, we have Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister. Let's listen in very, very quickly to what he said about the summit.
India, as this G20 is showing, is going to be one of the most important geopolitical actors over the next years and decades. It's important for the UK to have a close relationship with India. And as I said, Prime Minister Modi and I talked about all the different ways in which we can strengthen and deepen that partnership.
Well, Ambassador Wasbir, okay, it's fine. There has been tremendous appreciation of the G20 summit, the way it has been held by India. But the point here is from Srinagar in the north to Thiruvananthapuram in the south, from the Run of Kutch in the west to Guwahati in the east, the G20 meetings were held in 60 cities in India. And the Prime Minister has said a couple of days ago that 1.5 million Indians were directly or indirectly involved in this process. Now, taking out the G20 for the confines of the conference halls, how different is it? Do you think, what kind of an impact you see out of this?
Okay, in fact, one thing which is notable is, in fact, the way one of these meetings took place in Arunachal Pradesh.
Yes.
Which was, I think, a very bold move on the part of India to do it. And of course, China objected to it, but that was it. In fact, it showed that we are bold and candid enough about what we want to do. And in the process, I think India's image has gone up because of this, besides the other meeting in Srinagar also. Now, I was just, I listened to this interview of Brazilian President Lula da Silva in another channel. And he did say, in fact, he complimented the way India organized this G20, and particularly the fact that he said that Brazil is going to learn a lot from it. So I think, in fact, you were asking the other panelists before about what would happen to India in terms of becoming a member of the Security Council and all that. I think all these issues which were recommended in this declaration, ranging from climate change to the corridor to everything that's been mentioned there, women empowerment. If India is able to succeed in all these, I think gradually the process will start for the rest of the world to really support India in a big way to become a permanent member of the Security Council, if at all it materializes at some stage. So I think that this is a very important point the way I see it. But so we have to work very hard from now on, I think, for India. So especially that you heard what Brazilian President Lula and Prime Minister Sunak of UK said. So this is how I understood it.
Right. Ambassador Ponappa, during that summit, we also saw a lot of bilaterals. Then we saw the unveiling of the plans to have a mega economic corridor between India, Middle East and Europe. Now, on the other hand, we have this Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think it's a direct counter or attempt to counter the China's Belt and Road Initiative? How successful do you think the India-Middle East-Euro economic corridor linking the three areas, that is India, Middle East and Europe? This is a very ambitious project.
I think any of these major connectivity projects are something to be welcomed because connectivity then provides the kind of engagement that can lead to trade, to people contact, and also to investment and the creation of common stakeholders. But please note that that project had nothing to do with G20.
I know.
That is not part of the G20
I know.
outcome.
Yes, obviously.
But it is, in effect, you could say, a geo-economic project which has been interpreted as having geopolitical connotations. Now, we know that China's BRI has involved massive investment, has involved massive debt for some of the participants. There has been a latter-day realization for some of those who joined up, and they are having second thoughts about it, Italy being the latest. I think the attempt here, the connectivity that would matter. Now, this happens to be something that would take us westward. And although the countries concerned initially named were Saudi Arabia, UAE, the US as a partner, and India, the point is, where would this lead? Is it going to terminate in Saudi Arabia? No. As we've seen, the plans are to extend it all the way up to and beyond the Mediterranean. So that is good. Equally, there are opportunities in the East, and you, Wasbir, Rudy, all of us who have an interest in the development of our Eastern links would recognize this, that whether it's the trilateral highway project through Myanmar and Thailand, whether it is the possibility of a land bridge across the Kra Isthmus, which would allow multimodal transport and reduce transit around the Malacca Straits, or even talk of what I believe BIMSTEC had mentioned some years ago,
yes,
of sea and land connectivity through the port of Dawei in Myanmar to Kanchanaburi, Bangkok, and all of these would give India connectivity to the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. So, but these are sometimes long-term things, whether it's the Panama Canal or the Suez. You know, the gestation period is long, the investments are huge, and the decision-making is difficult. But coming back to this, I think the project itself, if it does provide the kind of connectivity, and it isn't just a question of putting in place a railroad or a road and putting up a sign saying this is the highway or this is the railroad. You've got to have the facilitation for the movement of trade, for the movement of people, and all that it involves, and the harmonization of systems. So I think that is event. I'm sorry, I lost track of your first point on this.
No, I was asking whether this connectivity is also a possible counter to the BRI directly.
Well, look, you can look at it that way if you wish to, but on the other hand, you can look at it as an addition, and I dare say that once it is in place, China would also want to make use of it. Now, don't forget that China is a member of G20. Despite all the reservations that not just India, but I think the entire international community has about the way China has been functioning, not just in terms of being assertive, but in terms of being aggressive.
Yes, Ambassador.
There are, at the same time, the idea is not to exclude China, but to make it a responsible partner.
Absolutely. Yes, Ambassador Rudy, you want to say something? Yeah. Yes, please go on.
Yeah, I want to make a comment on this. You know, this economic corridor between India, Middle East, all the way to Europe is a wonderful idea. Now, but India will have to do it with a difference, in the sense that you are asking about the BRI of China. Now, as it is, we know what the problems being faced by China with this BRI projects in many countries, especially in Africa. And some diplomats have told me in the past that they want India also to be in the picture. Now, India may not have the economic capacity of China. You can't compare with China because their sovereign wealth fund is something like $2 trillion. India's investment and infrastructure fund. We're not very sure how much it is, but I think the point is that I want to make is that India will have to really take the initiative, the leadership, in fact, to show how it can mobilize other countries in this process, especially the Gulf countries and the European countries also, to show that it is more a cooperative effort, a combined effort, rather than just being one upmanship like China doing it with the BRI. I think that's the point I want to make.
Right. One thing I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Ponappa, this 60 cities had the opportunity to host some meeting or the other connected to G20. Now my question is, do you think the Indian masses, the general masses in this country of 1.40 billion people, do you think they have come of age to understand foreign policy and diplomacy? How can that swing as far as election results are concerned? Can these be serious election issues? What is your perspective on this?
Okay, I'm not going to touch on the election aspect of it because I never call an election. I think the voters decide. But I'm glad you raised this question because, I see this summit as having three distinct features. One is the event itself, and there's no question that the organization was tremendous because of the level of participation, because of the number of participants and so on. Mind you, this is not the first time that Delhi has done it. At the NAM summit in 1983, there were 90 plus delegations and heads of state, of government and so on and so forth. But that was, I would say, in certain ways, a simpler time. And even there, the organization was huge. Today, it had to be massive because of security implications, because of the different movements involved of each of the delegations and the number of delegations and the areas covered. So the event was tremendous. I know our protocol, our security, our hospitality people have all worked very hard, and there's no question that it was. It went smoothly, perhaps a trifle showy, but that's a matter of different aesthetics. But then there is the process. And here I come to your point about these meetings held in different parts of the country. This, for so long, and I say this as a non-Delhiite, for so long, everything has been centered in Delhi. Whereas I think the strength of the country really lies in its vast area that needs involvement in what the government does, or in and that includes the state governments. And a small beginning was made, for example, when the Commonwealth heads of government met in Goa several years ago. That was, I think, when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister. And Rudy might recall that SARC meeting on women was held at Shillong for the first time.
Yes.
And the second SARC summit took place in Bangalore. But and how this process has developed, and if you take a look at the structure of the G20, it's not just a question of coming together for a summit, because this is where the process kicks in. They have two tracks. You have the Sherpas, that was led by Amitabh Kant in this case, as the Prime Minister's representative, and you have the finance track, which is headed by the Finance Minister and the Governor of the respective Reserve Banks. And they have working groups under them. And it was these working groups that met in different cities. Also under the Sherpas, you have what's called the initiatives, where I think the attempt is to start looking at out-of-the-box solutions. And then you have what are called the engagement groups, which are the track 2 bodies, non-governmental, which try to involve civic society into everything that is done. And I talked of the G20 agenda expanding from fiscal management to pretty much everything under the sun, which almost makes it a mini UN. So they cover empowerment, they cover labor, they cover youth and sports, they cover culture, and so on and so forth. And this, I think, has been good. Now, I have had people, service people that I interact with, even in Delhi, saying, "Kya cheez hai? What is this G20?" And one had to sort of try to explain that it is really part of India's engagement with the international community, which they all appreciate. There is certainly a growing recognition, I think, at all levels of Indian society, including in our smaller towns and rural areas, of the benefits of engagement with the rest of the world. So I think this would certainly contribute to it, and I think it's a very, very healthy precedent really to take such engagements out of Delhi so that people get to appreciate it. To what extent they believe that this is a substantial transformation, I cannot tell. I don't get into predictions of that kind. But I think it is a good thing that was done.
Absolutely. Final comments from you, Ambassador Rudy Wajri. What do you think at the end of the day?
Sorry?
What are your final comments? What do you
Please
think?
repeat
How
the
do you like to
question.
conclude? Can you hear me?
No, I would like to, since I am in Northeast here, I'm in Northeast, I'm in Shillong. Obviously, I'm very concerned about how whatever the G20 meetings has done for the Northeast and brought to Northeast all over the Northeast in the respective subjects, how they can be, what the follow-up will be. I'm very concerned about that. Because the practice has been that whatever has been happening from Delhi in this Northeast, hardly any follow-up is there. So for instance, now in Shillong, in Meghalaya, where I am, there was something about the spaced economy leaders meeting. Now this is especially in the context of what the India has done ISRO has done in landing the Chandrayaan-3 and the rover on the moon, south pole of the moon, which is a grand achievement for India. I would like something like this to be, to follow up, and then something can be gained out of it. Now, the same applies to Arunachal Pradesh, which is about, even though China didn't go there,
right,
all the more that we have to continue with it to prove the point. And similarly with other states in like clean energy in Tripura and this business meet in Sikkim. So this is how I would like to stress and focus upon about how these things can be continued and follow up regarding the Northeast.
Absolutely. I'd like to thank all my guests, Ambassador Ponappa, Ambassador Rudy Wajri, and Professor Soren Singh for participating.
Can I make a very brief comment?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. I come back to my opening comment that the G20 and everything that it represents, including this summit, the previous Bali summit, and whatever Brazil does next as the new president of the G20, is a process in multilateralism. And it is a quest of a group of countries wish to have multilateralism perform more effectively to get the kind of results that Rudy just talked about. How does it impact on the person on the street in each of our countries? So it's a step forward, but it's a milestone. There has been work done before. There will be work done ahead. And this is something that I believe India will contribute to in a substantive manner, despite the many challenges involved.
Absolutely. There are many challenges, and everybody is going to watch how some of these declaration points that have been mentioned in this declaration are going to be implemented. How it impacts the man on the street, that is also a big question. As Ambassador Ponappa said, the G20 started with the focus on economic issues, but now the G20 discusses pretty much everything under the sun. It's become some kind of a mini United Nations. The big question is whether this is going to propel India to get a seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and whether that gives India an edge in major issues. And India's multilateral approach, of course, gives it an edge as far as convincing differing factions, differing points of view, and that has been demonstrated very well in the G20 summit when 4 to 5 people among a huge team worked day and night to bring about that consensus. There were 15 drafts, 200 hours of work, and 300 bilateral meetings over the last 1 year in about 60 cities that has gone around to bring this final declaration. Before I end, let's quickly listen into what Prime Minister Modi had said on the Delhi declaration. He has said in Hindi that खुश खबर है. So let's listen to what Prime Minister Modi had said.
एक खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है।
The declaration. Now let's listen to our Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar on the Delhi Declaration.
At the start of the second session, the summit has adopted the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration. The G20 has contributed to making India world ready and the world India ready. The declaration that the leaders have agreed on today focuses on promoting strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. It seeks to accelerate progress on SDGs and has come up with an action plan accordingly. It envisages a green development pact for a sustainable future. It endorses high-level principles on lifestyle for sustainable development, voluntary principles on hydrogen, the Chennai Principles for a Sustainable and Resilient Blue Economy, and the Deccan Principles on Food Security and Nutrition, among others.
Okay, and the inclusion or induction of the African Union into the G20, making it G21, that has got a huge impact at the end of the day. As the Prime Minister said, it's going to take care on reduce the global trust deficit. Let's listen to Prime Minister on the inclusion of African Union into the G20 quickly.
सबका साथ की भावना से ही भारत ने प्रस्ताव रखा था कि अफ्रीकन यूनियन को G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता दी जाए। मेरा विश्वास है कि इस प्रस्ताव पर हम सबकी सहमति है। आप सबकी सहमति से मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं।
All right, Prime Minister there declaring the inclusion of the African Union there, and that was also a defining moment of the two-day summit. And finally, viewers, let's listen in to Mr. Azali Assoumani, the chairperson of the African Union, on the inclusion of the group into the G20.
C'est un bel avenir. En tout cas, cette coopération existait. Il y a une forte population indienne qui est installée aux Comores depuis, je dirais même, des siècles.
All right. That is the statement that the African Union chairman had made after the African Union was included into the G20. And massive achievement, a huge achievement for India. And now, of course, all eyes will be on India. And as I've asked the question to my panelists, what next? We'll have to wait and watch. I thank the panelists for participating in the discussion and the viewers for watching the show. Good night and goodbye.